Uh, Good afternoon, dear colleagues, and welcome back. Always a very interesting time to facilitate a session after lunch when uh, people tend to doze off, but I'm sure together we will be able to navigate. Having heard about the conversations and the discussions in the morning, a few colleagues provided a few solutions, but it was a lot of the conversations revolved around the issues and teasing us to think about potential solutions. So the session this afternoon would focus on how we collaborate as stakeholders, as civil society, and others to respond to some of the challenges to civic space and to philanthropy that we discussed during the morning period. I hope that we have a lot of time or more time for discussions, and that the presentations help us to think further about what some of those solutions would look like. Without wasting much time, I'd like to call on Awino um, from the School of Oriental and African Studies, all the way from London. I don't know if Awino is ready to go.
Yes, thank you very much. And thanks again to CAPSI for the invitation to come and speak briefly. I'll really just take about 7 to 10 minutes so that we leave enough time for conversation, both amongst the panelists, but also with the members of the audience. My task or my invitation today was to think through the role that philanthropy plays, or the shifting funding landscape plays in impacting questions around women's rights and gender much more broadly, and looking specifically at how the funding landscape has impacted funding for women's rights and feminist movements specifically. I do want to note that this is sort of tracking work that several organizations have been doing for over a decade now. So even though a lot of conversations on the philanthropy space have sort of gained ground recently, the preoccupation with the amount of resources that are given towards gender equality, despite public proclamations around a commitment to gender equality, is one that has preoccupied feminist movements for a decade plus now. The second thing to foreground is also the important role that feminist funds have and continue to play around philanthropic advocacy. For the purposes of the African continent, I think it's important to mention organizations such as African Women's Development Fund, Urgent Action Fund Africa, the other foundation, as some of those organizations that have played a critical role both continentally, but also globally in conversations around shifting the power, in thinking through with funders around funding strategy rather than funding projects, in centering the place of organizations as change-making agents who can determine and guide how resources are distributed in a manner that is fair, just, and does not reproduce the same power inequalities that have historically shaped funding relationships that most of us are familiar with and which were already discussed in the morning. So I want to turn now briefly to just a number of statistics and then conclude with some observations. And these statistics are drawn from recent studies done by the Black Feminist Fund, studies done by AWID, Association of Women's Rights in Development, as well as other studies that have sort of been tracking the funding landscape, particularly as it affects women's rights organizations. So what are some of the things that we know? We know that 48% of women's rights and feminist organizations from the Global South report that their most recent fiscal year budget was less than $30,000. So if we are thinking about resourcing as both political strategy, but also resourcing as making a dent in the kinds of change-making work that we see as essential to shifting some of the structural inequalities, think about 30,000 USD a year within that particular context. 99% of development aid and foundation grants still do not directly reach women's rights and feminist organizations, particularly those groups that are working at the intersection of various forms of marginalization. So whether these are organizations dealing with indigenous rights, migrant, refugees, young feminists, sex workers, or queer organizing. So even though there's a lot of speak around funding for gender equality, when you track the figures, when you track where the money is actually going, we are still observing that 99% of development aid and private foundation grants are not directly reaching women's rights and feminist organizations. It is also noted that women's rights organizations receive only 0.13% of official development assistance and only 0.4% of all gender-related aid. So it means, therefore, that when governments say that they are, international governments say that they are contributing significantly to gender equality, these are resources that are not necessarily directly reaching women's rights organizations, but might be going to other institutions, including governments, as part of that resourcing for gender equality. Again, if we talk about the impact of funding as a way to determine whether commitments around gender equality are actually being met, then the current landscape in relation to gender inequalities writ large allows us to make an assessment of whether the resources that have been directed to institutions other than those who center women's rights and gender equality as their primary objective has actually met the objectives that it was desired to meet. So in essence, this is really an invitation to assess all of the resourcing given to governments to meet gender equality objectives and what that is actually doing to shift the dial on inequalities as they sit at the axis of gender. Now, it's also noted in a recent study produced by the Black Feminist Fund that even though human rights funding has increased and is increasing overall, women and girls, so as a constituency, now we are not necessarily talking about organization, but women and girls receive only approximately 752 million, and that is about 20% of the overall human rights funding. Bilateral funding on gender equality, even though that has been steadily increasing to about 53 billion between 2018 and 2019, that the sort of increase in bilateral funding, the increase in human rights funding to 44.5%, but also the increase in overall human rights funding and the proportion that is allocated to women's rights and women and girls in particular tells a particular story around underfunding. So the distribution or the weight of distribution of resources still continues to illustrate an underfunding of women and girls as a constituency and an underfunding of women and feminist, women's rights and feminist organizations as a sort of container for thinking through social movement, social justice and movement building shifts. Finally, a rather interesting study that was recently produced by the Black Feminist Fund, which is one of the first and only fund that I'm aware of at the moment that prioritizes the question of race and gender as a central focal point of thinking through change making, and in this instance, centralizing the question of funding Black feminists and funding Black feminist movements, recognizing that even when we talk about women's rights and social movements, and feminist organizations much more broadly, the questions that sit at the intersection of gender, race, and class are not necessarily adequately addressed within this broad ambit. So really that is the mission of the Black Feminist Fund. And what did they find? They found that 13.76% of human rights funding, so remember earlier on I noted that human rights funding is increasing, and that 752 million or 20% of that overall funding goes to women and girls. The Black Feminist Fund finds that only 13.76% of that funding actually goes towards serving Black communities globally. So this is not even a continental figure. We are talking about a global community of Black feminist actors. Now, what is it that we could draw? What conclusions could we possibly draw from this landscape that I've offered in relation to funding, philanthropy, and its impact on women's rights and feminist organizations? I think there's been lots of feminist scholarship and social movement scholarship that has illustrated the importance of organizations, whether it's bilateral funders, private foundations, the importance of them funding strategy rather than funding projects. And what this research, when you dig into it, begins to illustrate is that we are still seeing a continued commitment to funding projects rather than funding long-term projects and funding strategic visions of movements and organizations rather than necessarily strategic movements, strategic visions of organizations rather than a focus on projects. The second thing that can be observed from this landscape that I've pointed to is the critical intervention that feminist funds have begun to make, particularly in acting as a sort of security blanket, if you will, because a lot of the larger foundations and a lot of international donors will make arguments around risk. And feminist funders have always made the argument that if you want to fund change making, then you need to reduce the amount of hurdles that are required to get resources to communities when they need it and in the form that they need it, right? So a cycle, application cycle windows, for instance, that somebody alluded to earlier, the sort of massive reporting requirements that are needed for organizations to actually determine proof of concept and whether resources are being used effectively. The kinds of demands that are made around registration as the only way in which resources can be distributed to organizations. And feminist funds have therefore played a critical role in mitigating some of these risks that larger donors see as hurdles they cannot necessarily get around. So I think this has been an important intervention. And to mitigate that risk does not mean that we do not take seriously the need for accountability, mutual accountability, and the importance of reflection, action, and research as part of the process of learning about change-making strategies and change in the societies that feminist movements and women's rights organizations are intervening in. The third and final point that is worth observing, particularly given the current climate across various countries in Eastern Africa and West Africa, particularly as these have emerged around ideas that are connected to gender and sexual identity, is how that legal landscape, which is often animated around the idea of anti-homosexuality bills, actually ends up corralling a whole range of historical work that has been linked to larger and broader questions around gender equality and sexuality writ large, and not necessarily sexual orientation. So what we're observing here are two things: a potential rollback in some of the gains that have been made by women's rights organizations, but also a broader observation about the resources that are available to hegemonic movements that are seeking to make these rollbacks. I will stop here for now, Chair.
I know colleagues cannot hear you because they don't have the mic, but I think Owino deserves a round of applause. Thank you so much, Owino, for those critical remarks. I don't want to summarize them now because I'd prefer to allocate more time to panelists and even more time for discussion, so that hopefully participants will be able to ask you some questions during the Q&A session. We'll now move on to Oswald Jumira, who is also from CAPSI, but fortunately or unfortunately will be joining online as well. So over to you, Oswald.
Looking at how technology can actually enable CSOs, and also some of the demerits of technology and how we can actually be able to address some of those challenges. So there's a deck that I've done. My network is quite bad. Apologies for that. And I think my colleague Wycliffe, I've given a deck that I just wanted to quickly go through. I'm not going to take much of your time because I do understand that there's going to be another question and answer section and also other presentations from fellow colleagues. So just a quick background. My background is in tech, and I build solutions that address problems at a continental level. And I pride myself in having built a couple of platforms that are being used at CAPSI, some that are being used at a continental level by African Union and other institutions on the continent. So one of the areas that I'm going to focus on right now is based on the topic that was shared, which looks at stakeholder collaboration in redressing civic space challenges. And I would want to speak from the lens of leveraging technology from a perspective of trying to address this area and fostering collaboration. You can move to the next slide, Wycliffe. So basically, I think the key barriers or challenges that fellow CSO representatives, executives are facing today across our continent have been actually highlighted through some publication that Becky led with the team across the continent. And the title of the publication was Barriers to African Civil Society, Building the Sector's Capacity and Potential to Scale Up. It's a very interesting document, which I believe most of you guys have actually gone through, and you guys have actually probably picked some learnings from there, associated with some of the feedback, contributed to the feedback. But I think some fellow colleagues have also spoken about funding as a challenge. Obviously, the complexities around funding, how you put your proposals together, the language, it has become a challenge for our African continent, because it seems bigger organizations, well-established organizations, keep getting funding. Some smaller organizations, obviously, due to capacity, will always fail. There's obviously a lack of trust and various negative perceptions about local CSOs from within the industry, from external parties, from the donors. There is a lot. And one of the learnings that I learned recently, talking to Becky, was actually the fact that most of the due diligence that is taken up by the donors is based out of mistrust. It's more like coming from a perspective of, oh, are you not abusing the money? We don't trust you with the money. So the M&E valuations that happen, some of them have a context that is quite disturbing. And these are some of the challenges that CSOs face. Obviously, governance, leadership become a challenge. Obviously, regulatory environment is not easy today. We are seeing this in many countries on the continent, globally. And this is an area that I think with more collaboration, we can be able to address. Obviously, in some cases, we see the lack of agile systems, which is an area that I'm very passionate about. How do you bring in systems that enable scale, that enable organizations to structure themselves in a way that they can attract funding and also comply with some of the donor requirements? Obviously, there's a lot of power dynamics that is happening in this industry. All of us on the call, I think, are very aware of this. And the idea is, how do we contain that? So based on some of the research that I'm working on right now with Prof. Jacob, Becky, I think there is a lot of learnings that Becky tried to showcase in the document that he prepared. And piggybacking on that, I think there's a lot that we from this industry can actually do in order to leverage on collaboration to address these challenges and obviously unlock new opportunities. You can move to the next slide. So basically, one of the things that I look at is what are the advantages of CSOs collaborating? I think there's been a lot of literature written around this. And in some of the research, you guys obviously have these numbers in mind. We see about 10 million organized CSOs globally. And the question is, if 10 million institutions are operating globally, to what level are they collaborating? And to what level are they coming together to address some of the challenges at different levels of the organizations in different countries? But the beauty of it is, if we all come together, I do believe there's a growth of a sector that we can drive. Self-governance can be instilled. Sustainability obviously becomes an output. Partnerships are no-brainer in that context. Transparency becomes something that is our day-to-day life. Legitimacy is obviously grounded through such. Credibility can also be born, and increased influence. Increased influence today is very, very important. There are many lobbying bodies, many organizations that have come together to fight different legislations and to fight for different agendas in different countries. Obviously, formulation of policy becomes something that the collaborations can actually unlock. I'm not very old in this industry, but I've been doing a lot of literature review, and these are some of the advantages and benefits that I've actually picked up. And I think, tying to the proverb that we have on this continent, that if we want to go fast, you go alone. If you want to go far, you go together. So the idea of collaboration for me is, how does the industry come together? How do like-minded and unlike-minded people come together based on a certain agenda and drive that agenda to fruition in terms of unlocking opportunities? You can move to the next slide. So basically, I'm a tech guy, so I come from technology, and obviously looking at the lens of technology, everyone on this platform, in the room where people are, has multiple devices that they have. So in this continent, 5.18 billion people have access today to the internet. And that's 64% of the world's population. for whether you like it or not, one way or the other, the beneficiary, the funder, the authorities that we're dealing with, they all are interfacing with technology. Technology and digital transformation is actually a mega trend, which we cannot run away from. It is actually influencing how people work, communicate, are governed, and ultimately shaping the cultures that we have today. And 82% of global CSOs saw services disrupted by forced digital changes during the pandemic. It was painful for a number of organizations who had not geared up for such a scenario that we witnessed during the pandemic. And because of that, I think every this room in this could be very impactful. We've got many people using digital platforms in different methods, either to create opportunities, either to profile opportunities.
I see.
Either to get information. There's the darker side of this technology. There's a digital divide that exists. Some CSOs in different jurisdictions, different locations, do not
We've lost you.
have access to this digital technology. And we're also seeing a lot of operating spaces being created by this technology, which is now bringing about collaboration that are starting to exist together collectively and mobilizing through digital platforms. Today, I'm speaking on quite a big network. However, people are listening to me, collaborating through Zoom. So there's so many platforms that have come to us that are enabling us to collaborate. As I come to the end of this short presentation, Wycliffe, you can move the next slide. The question that I'm starting to ask myself as I do some of this research work is, what can we build within this ecosystem in these organizations in order to foster this collaboration, leveraging technology? We can leverage on many other options of convening. However, I do believe technology is what cuts across many boundaries, and we're starting to see examples of platforms that are enabling collaboration. CAPSI has built a couple of those platforms, and we are seeing some other tools being built by organizations like Epic, who are looking at the CSO database across the whole continent and how to provide an interaction across those CSOs. We are seeing people developing CSO indexes on different topics, which is another area of collaboration. There's a lot of trainings that are happening online to capacitate people. And obviously, we are leveraging on existing social media platforms and different other professional platforms to collaborate. So for me, speaking from a challenges perspective and how to address them, I'm more biased towards what I know best, which is technology, and asking myself to say, within this industry, within this sector, how do we then embrace technology to collaborate and to enable the perpetual existence of organizations and the capacitation of organizations? And I welcome the conversation that we're going to have around this topic. But like I said, my biases are more towards how to use technology to address problems. Thank you very much.
Oswald. Thank you so much for riding on despite the challenges with technology. We hope you can hear us, and please stay on for the Q&A session. Before I forget, I just want to throw back one question to you. You talked a lot about collaboration, particularly collaboration in relation to technology and technological innovations. But I wanted to link that to some of the points raised by Awino, that we still have groups, feminist groups, women's groups, and groups working on girls and children that are excluded even within civil society. So who are we collaborating with, and how do we ensure that we reach out to excluded groups? And in relation to that, despite the advances made in technological innovations and we are able to connect here while you are somewhere in your office, we still have a large mass of people, particularly in the global south, who are still not connected. How do we ensure that we bring them on board as far as solutions are concerned and as we have these conversations. So just 2 questions for you to think about when we get to the Q&A session. I am now going to hand over to Wycliffe. It's an honor to listen to you twice on the same day, so please go for it. You have 10 minutes.
So I'm standing in here, I don't know in what capacity, for someone who fell ill and could not come. But ideally, last year I was, no, it's called digital. I think I insist that you need to see it. Okay, so last year, I think early last year, I was contracted by Charities Aid Foundation to conduct a study on digital for good. So this study came up with publication. I mean, they were also contracted by Lilly School of Philanthropy, who does the study of Global Philanthropy Index. So my study was based in South Africa, and yeah. Actually very much connected to what Oswald was talking about earlier. So in this study, what we are trying to look at is how does disasters like COVID-19 drive innovations, especially in giving. And so we found some observations that were driven by COVID-19. We looked at 6 ways of giving that were quite prominent at that point in time. So there was crowdfunding. Obviously, crowdfunding has been there for ages and ages in different forms and manners. And there was retail giving, there was mobile giving, there was payroll giving, which is another form of corporate philanthropy. Of course, retail giving is also emerging strongly as a form of corporate philanthropy. And there was for good, which is also a virtual volunteering that is also a form of corporate philanthropy. And there was also expression of the black people in their own blackness, what we call the black tax. So my study, concentrated on those. The CEO of CAPSI was supposed to come and present because I was just to do the work, and they were supposed to now take over. The work is theirs. So we found that disaster-driven innovations resulted in many new ways of giving at that point in time. And this was mainly driven by the global dynamics and the adaptive nature that each and every individual's organizations needed to have at that point in time. I mean, you know the disruptions that COVID-19 created. And then the impact of COVID-19 was quite disruptive in a way that for the government to respond, you understand the idea of lockdowns, the restrictions of movement. And so this one created many ways of giving at that point, in time. So focusing on crowdfunding, although crowdfunding has existed in South Africa for several decades, it has existed mainly in terms of stokvels. Those who understand it, I think you may understand it better. In Kenya, I think they call it, Prof. Jacob, what do they call it in Kenya? Roscas, the chamas. So those are the ways of sourcing funds from the crowd in Kenya. So we found that in South Africa during COVID-19, the crowdfunding ballooned, and up to 200 million rands were collected using crowdfunding at that point in time. And also, one of our finding again was mobile giving. Although South Africa has not been great in mobile giving compared to Kenya or the East African countries, but during COVID-19, this one also had an upward shot. And we realized that the increase in smartphone usage, mobile subscriptions, internet penetrations, these are the issues or the factors that necessitated the upshot in mobile giving. Another form that we also found out was on payroll giving. So most organizations, with their employees, they have this thing called the matched giving. So for instance, organization A would say that employees, we have this project, or we have these needs that perhaps we need to fund in the society. If you are willing, give 200 rands, we will match it by another 200 rand. So we found out that during COVID-19, South Africans being more prone to giving, this one also had a very, very upshot had a very upper trajectory. It was we discovered that there was a lot of funds which were raised for charities, especially the organizations who could not raise money using the formal fundraising methods. And then there is For Good, which is another volunteering method. So For Good volunteering is a new form, but it's necessitated by technology. So it's where employees of the organizations volunteer, but virtually. The mechanics of doing it has a lot of challenges, especially because of the technological divide. And one of the things we found in the study is that, actually, I invite you to go and read the study. One of the things we found in the study is that COVID-19 lockdown stopped what we call the face-to-face volunteering. And for the organizations which needed what we call skills-based volunteering, could only do that or could only assess that through the virtual interface. So, and the virtual volunteering enlarged, had a huge pool created, and it also ended up increasing the number of donors who want to partake in that to enable employees to continue with their volunteering, especially the ones who are volunteering the skills-based volunteering. And then the black tax, which is not new. It's been in South Africa, and not just South Africa, it's an African way of giving. So it's normally not reported, and we saw it's not tracked, so we don't know the trends. But our study, especially when the few interviews that we conducted, we found that a lot of people with sort of financial strength had to support several family members during that point in time. And so the financial support from black professionals to their families had rose by more than 17%. From the previous year that before COVID. And the contribution from the emerging black middle class also had an upper shot. So this is the summary of our study during COVID-19, and I invite you to go to the Lilly School of Philanthropy website to read this study. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Wycliffe, and thanks for stepping in for Jill. We would now hand over to our last presenter, Roslyn, who will be sharing some lessons from Tanzania. Roslyn, over to you.
Okay, good afternoon. Okay, thank you so much, David, for this opportunity. So I want to take you back to the barriers and all that, because I was doing a study on the barriers to civil society in Tanzania, but I'll try to maybe align it with the theme that we had, which is collaboration. So my study was So I'll start with the background, and then I'll look at the barriers to civil society in Tanzania, and then the role of philanthropy and technology. So if we talk about the background in Tanzania, so we thought I can go to the East Africa. Maybe there are some differences there. So if we talk about the civil society in Tanzania, it has come a long way. So it started in the 1920s during the British colonial rule. So during that time, there were so many organizations. Remember, we say CSO is a fluid concept. So in that case, it encompassed cooperative movements, pastoralist movements, and even some of the political movements. So in the 1940s, there were some labor and nationalistic movements which were fighting for the freedom, for independence. So in 1954, the then leader of what you call the Tanganyika African Association, who later on became the president, Julius Nyerere, reformed his association, which became what you call the Tanganyika African National Union. So at the same time, the civil movement was being spearheaded to maybe fight for the independence. So after the independence, this one-party system actually attacked those organizations and abolished most of them. The next slide, please. So because of that, the government itself took over most of the delivery of the services, but they were not delivering. That's when the civil society, the donors themselves shifted their power and focused on the civil society organizations. So that's when now they started to come up with the modern kind of civil society that we have in Tanzania. Sorry. So when the government realized that these are some of the participants or the key participants in the economy, they started to maybe look at the policies that maybe focus on these organizations. So if we look at the state of the art of the CSOs in Tanzania, they are getting bigger, numerous, and more sophisticated. So let's look at some of the barriers to these local CSOs in Tanzania, and I'll try to bring in the collaboration part of it. So the external barriers that are mainly maybe these CSOs focus in Tanzania or faces in Tanzania, the legal and policy environment. There's also the funding, the localization agenda, and we have the internal barriers, which are the trust, transparency, and accountability, and organizational capacity building for NGOs. So when I look at these barriers, I look at it in terms of these are some of the root causes of the shrinking space in Tanzania. And if you ask me, for example, the legal and policy framework, so if you realize Tanzania is one of those countries that maybe I can say the space for the civil society is shrinking. And the reason for the last 10 years, especially during the late Makafuli's regime, there were a lot of regulations that were happening in the CSO space or the civic space. For instance, the NGO Act of 2002 was amended. So in that case, even the registration of the NGOs, before they were registered under the business registration or licensing agency, which they call the BRELA, or under the registrar of the NGOs. But because of those amendments, they were required to actually register under the Ministry of Health, Community Development, Gender, Elderly, and Children, which is a government department. So in that case, it gave most of the government officials the power to do what they decide to do with those NGOs, which we saw a lot of them being deregistered, a lot of the politicians being maybe harassed, and there was a lot of fear that was going on. So when you look at the registration process, even this year alone in 2023, there were about 4,898 NGOs which were deregistered. And when you want to ask the reason why, it's because of those policies which are in place. And the reason is because the government, the international NGOs or the donors, and the local NGOs, there is a lot of friction where they see each other as enemies instead of working together in collaboration to see how they can improve on these policies. But however, during the current regime, there are a lot of flexibility, a little bit, because the current president can maybe listen to the voices of those civil society organizations. But the complaint is, yes, they can listen to them. They can even sit with the officials. But still, the laws in that, the amended laws have not been maybe reversed or maybe made flexible for them to be able to function. So in that case, they cannot even be able to open that space, because in case they do anything that's against the government, they are still going to be held accountable because those laws are still in place. So let's look at the funding. Funding, who doesn't have a problem with funding? So always when you ask them what some of the challenges, they talk about funding. So in Tanzania, funding is a major challenge. And for me, when I was questioning them, so let me show you the overview before I go to maybe the state of the art. So when you look at the next slide, sorry, I can't see. Next slide. Until you get to funding. Oh, it's there. There's another table before that. Yes. So when you look at the overview of the funding in Tanzania between the year 2003 and 2019, there are about 932 different organizations spread across that have funded these organizations, that are being funded. So when you look at the major areas that are funded, you will see that the human rights sector is the one which is funded most, which maybe takes about almost over 50% of the funding. And that's where the problem is. Because when you talk about the human rights, and maybe that's what the late Makafuli was fighting, is because human rights, they talk about the donors coming up with their own agendas, bring their own foreign agendas, whether it's the gender equality issues or even the issues about the LGBTQ, which you know if you look at the East Africa right now, for example, Kenya recently, or even Uganda, where they passed the Anti-Homosexuality Act. So in that case, those are some of the things which are still influenced by the cultural, maybe, setup in the countries. So when you look at some of the funding issues, which I'm not going to go deep into, there is overdependence of foreign funding. They claim that the projects are project-based, which are short-term kind of funding. There's also competition between the international NGOs and the local NGOs, where we find the international NGOs coming to the country and registering as local NGOs. So in that case, they have the capacity to be able to absorb most of this funding, which maybe the local NGOs cannot be able to. But the problem is, if we question the shrinking space, for me, I feel like the local civil society organizations in the country are also enablers of this shrinking space, because we talked earlier about who is actually shrinking this space. So most of these issues come also from the local NGOs. And we ask why is because I feel like they are in their comfort zone. When you interview them and you tell them and you ask them, what are some of the alternatives? How are you solving these issues? They actually start to fold their hands. But when they were talking about the funding challenge, they have this open hand, which shows that they are not ready to be able to mobilize the resources themselves, but they are used to getting funding from maybe the donors, foreign donors. So in that case, that's another issue, because if you cannot do it yourselves, then who else is going to feed you for the rest of your life? So some of the issues, though, which I saw the donors coming up in the about the resource mobilization, they have started what they call consortiums. So in that case, these donors, because they know the local NGOs do not have the capacity, so they bring in most of these local NGOs, which is complement each other. Maybe another one has expertise in one area and another one in another area. And they try to bring them together to build that capacity. There's also, when you talk about those in service delivery, they charge some fees. We talk about the churches, maybe they have schools where they generate revenue. There's also the funding from the private sector, which is coming up, which deals with the philanthropy. So in that case, we see if they can collaborate, there could be some hope of maybe getting some of the funding to come locally than actually depending on the donors. Next slide, please. So the next one is what you call the localization. So when you talk about this, is a buzzword which is going on around. But if you look at it, we are actually talking about the local people taking the ownership of these projects. Because it's like, as we talked earlier on about this shrinking civic space, we are talking about the power imbalances. But it seems like most of the NGOs, the local NGOs, have given so much power either to the government or to their donors. So in that case, they do not maybe participate in decision making and all that. So you see the decision making comes from the top. In that case, they dictate which projects come to the country. That's why you can see like the human rights. Maybe it's true they want to bring in their own foreign agendas. But in that case, what are you saying as the local NGOs in the ground? So in that case, they have given a lot of powers. But it should also, we should focus on the horizontal collaboration, where the local people are the ones to bring in the knowledge from the ground and maybe complement with what the international NGOs are bringing. So some of the recommendation is maybe there is no policy in place to regulate this localization. How do you manage? Another thing is power needs to come from the local NGOs. Don't leave a lot of power to the donors to dictate exactly what is happening in your own country. Another problem that I see is that the communities, the beneficiaries themselves, they don't even know their own rights. They don't know their own responsibilities in that space. So in that case, they need to be empowered. Another challenge is the, next slide please, organizational capacity. So when we were interviewing the civil societies in Tanzania, and you ask them, can you absorb some of the funding that come from the large funding? And most of them say no. And you ask them, so what are you doing about it? And they actually do not have a solution. And what happened in this space is that even though they don't have the capacity to absorb all these funds, they are not thinking about doing what? Collaborating with other maybe local NGOs to see how they can expand. So in that case, it limits them. And another thing is that there is a lot of competition. It's competition about the money. Instead of thinking about how can we collaborate, they are thinking about how can we get that money that the donors have. So in that case, they limit their own space. So maybe some of the interventions that I saw from the funders themselves is that they bring in their own experts, especially training in leadership, training in some of the services that they provide. So they come with their own in-house training to their beneficiaries. Another thing is to take advantage, maybe the local NGOs nowadays, because they lack the funding, they take advantage of the technology. Next slide, please. So I'm almost done. So another challenge is fragmentation and spatial imbalances. So in that case, you can see fragmentations mean there are so many small NGOs, and I talk about competition, where they focus on the same issue. So instead of collaborating and expanding their own capacity, they all want to do the same thing at the same time. So they are actually fighting for this funding. Another issue that I found out is that there are so many spatial imbalances. There are so many local NGOs in the urban areas than in the rural areas, which also maybe affect their funding. So let's talk about the role of philanthropy. So in Tanzania, the role of philanthropy is still very young. And people, they seem to put it in this one umbrella where they think that philanthropy belongs to the civil society. And when you talk about the high net worth individuals, you talk about the private sector. They were asking, why are these organizations forming their own foundation instead of funding us to be able to do the work in the ground? So you realize that there is a lot of lack of awareness of what philanthropy or the role of philanthropy should be in the country. So I think up to there, that's the end. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Roslyn, and thank you for being mindful of time. I will now open the floor for questions, comments, and general discussions, and hope our colleagues who are online are still there. Please keep it short so that other colleagues can have the opportunity to also ask questions. Yes.
Thank you. My name is Kay Sbanda. My question goes to Oswald and even you, Brother David. We were talking about technology Okay, like you said, I must be brief otherwise, but otherwise I've got a lot of things to say about technology. Right here in this continent, in the African continent, when you look at the statistics, we are lagging behind when it comes to technology. For example, right here in South Africa, I think our population is more than 60 million. But if you look at people who are using technology, maybe 10 or 15%. Maybe I'm wrong there. Now, my question is, as recently as last month, we celebrated 60th anniversary of the African Union. But prior to that, there was an agreement among the African states, which I think is called the Africa Free Trade, something. All right, whatever, yes. So, now, seeing that you are lagging behind, so what have you done, my brother, to assist us, especially the BBTs? When I say BBTs, there's BBTs and .com kids. The BBTs are like people like us, born before technology. We still believe using the old method, writing a letter, going to the post office, whereas there's internet, which is mostly used by the .com kids like yourself. You can read things online, right? So now, Africa has got a potential. So I don't know, have you perhaps approached some big guys like in Silicon Valley there, the likes of Billy Gates, the oracles, to come and assist us in Africa so that at least we can leapfrog, and then so that there will be much easier collaboration in terms of the fourth industrial revolution. I don't know, what's your take there on that one? Thank you.
Thank you.
And I want to thank her for this inspiring presentation. I didn't say in the morning, but our organization is implementing a WVL program, which was actually based, has a thesis to answer the question, what happens when money is given to women? So we have received this funding from the government of Canada, and our role is to facilitate resource, to provide resources to women rights organizations, multi-year funding, capacity building, and networking funding to support their efforts to promote gender equality. So from what Awino said, I wanted to add that it's not only about putting money in women rights organizations, but it is also to finance or to put money to support a vision, to support best practices and approaches that have been proven to result. For instance, in how the WVL program is implemented in 32 countries, and not only in Africa. And what we have learned is that we like a kind of a feminist male system which works as a kind of a bond. I mean, and this, it's clear, and it's a kind of it's also a suggestion from the government of Canada that we implement the program but with a very robust feminist male system. The point is, money is not given to implement the male system, and we are also advised to implement a great principles, a noble principles, I would say, of inclusion, participation, and empowerment. But it also costs money, which is not given to us. For instance, inclusion, it's not that simple. If you think about vulnerable women or women with disability, when you want to bring them on board, sometimes it means that you need 2 more people to support that one woman who comes to your capacity building trainings, who comes to your mentoring sessions, who you at the end of the day have to support. I mean, provide. So how do you get that money? How can we make it work if we are still funding projects, we are still giving money to administrative costs, but not to support the vision and the approaches that work well? Thank you.
Thank you to the panel for such an interesting conversation. Very quickly, mine is not a question per se, but maybe a discussion in relation to a point that was raised by Roslyn around the issue, excuse me, of local communities who are found sort of like not knowing their rights and needing to be empowered around their rights. And maybe as part of a broader conversation, for us, people who do work like research, development work, and other different work, to rethink maybe the spaces where we're doing our work in relation to the agency of the people on the ground, and to ask ourselves whether the programs that we're bringing, if then we find people on the ground needing to be quote unquote empowered to understand their rights and everything, perhaps maybe we need to rethink the work that we're doing in terms of, are we doing the work for the people, or are we doing work with the people? Because sometimes I think this is an old conversation around why development projects sometimes fail, because we tend to get to the space and then we bring quote unquote savior complex to try and save the masses from where they are and the people that we're working with. But maybe a different conversation around what happens if they take charge of the programs or any work that we bring to them and then own it and make it theirs. At what point are we being led by them and their understanding of their everyday lived experiences and how they shape the space that they live in, of which then they open it up to for us to enter as we come with different conversations to them. Thank you.
Yeah, so my question as well speaks to what she's saying, and it speaks to the initial conversation that was started by Sipho around the shrinking space, civic space. So firstly, my question is, when if I heard Rosalind quietly, she was mostly basing a research on NGOs or the formal civic space. So now my question is, so if NGOs are being, let's say for example, NGOs are being banned and they're being restricted, then what does it mean in terms of the response of the communities and the populations that they are fighting for, or that they are dealing with? Because the issues remain the same. For example, if it is the issues of the LGBTQ whatever community, and then NGOs are being banned that work along those lines, gay people will still be there in that particular community. Then what is the response of those people that are affected by that? Are they standing up for their own rights in a manner that Malema calls an unled revolution, which means that they're not formalized through the NGO sector, which is registered and given money, but it is people talking and working about their issues on the ground, informally so so those informal social movements that are rallying behind a particular issue. So are we seeing that effect where the formal NGO space is closing and then the informal is rising to fill in the gap, because the issues have remained the same? You know, if there's no water, there's no water. Because NGO that delivers water has been chased out of the country, doesn't mean that there will be water and the issue remains the same. So are we seeing that kind of reaction? Thank you.
I want to take us back to where we began this morning. But to Prince, have you seen communities demonstrating against an NGO? Have you seen any community demonstrating against an NGO? The way we toy against local government? Have you seen them do the same for an NGO? Yes or no? No, you have never seen. Okay, some years ago, some of us led a demonstration against an international NGO of international repute because they were helping us at building classrooms for 4 times the amount of money that we built ourselves. And it didn't make sense to us. So we told them they can go with their money, and it was a big problem. They came with the police. We told them they need to go. We are not interested. Yes, because it's, why do you want to capitalize on our misery and do things that do not make sense to us? Same quality, same everything. So it's the political economy that Sipo was talking to this morning. But I said we need to probably take ourselves back to the conversation. A lot of the conversation about this civic space since morning has been around the political side of things, the relationship with the state. And if I got it right at some point, Professor Fowler, and I think some of the conversations, Rose, the presentation that she's just done, and a few others have started speaking to an element which I think is important, but which is lacking in our conceptions of, whether a pragmatic conception or not, of civic space, money, going back to that. So as we conceive what civic space looks like or what ought to be on our continent, and probably for the project that we are working on, is money a concern in enabling or disenabling, or should we completely ignore that and just look at back at the tree, and this particular tree is supposed to be government, which is supposed to be guarantor of the space. It's not just for you, it's to everyone. And of course, technology, also, and my brother, you may be able to help us, because it's, 10, 12 years ago, there was a lot of excitement, especially in northern part of Africa, the Arab Spring. I don't know whether the spring is still springing or it's dead. But these are conversations I would love to hear, because it's, and how philanthropy in so many ways can be able to either aid that or arrest some of these particular type of conversations or even developments. Because I think in as much as we are talking about the people, we are talking about governments, we are talking about capital and all these others, where is the money in everything that we are trying to do? Going back to probably paraphrasing, where are the people? Now, where is the money and how is it taking us in particular directions? Do we even need to consider it in our conceptions of civic space?
Thank you so much, Jacob. When you started, I thought you were responding to his question, but you took us back and now posed 2 or 3 questions to us. But I'll hand over to the panelists. I wonder if you want to respond to a colleague's question about what you raised on funding strategy versus projects, and then Oswald, the question around bridging gaps in technology. I think it's very, very important. We may laugh about it, but there are large sections of populations that do not have access to technology. I mean, if I have to speak to my grandma in the village, I need to identify a date on a Monday. She goes up to the top of the hill and then she takes a call because there's no network wherever she is. So it even affects us in many ways than we realize. So we'll start with Awino and Oswald online, and then there were maybe a couple of questions for you, Roslyn, and then we'll then hand over to Wycliffe. Awino?
Yeah, thanks very much. I read or understood the comment about funding strategy and all of that as building on what I'd said rather than a question. So let me just say 4 things that I wanted to sort of wrap up with, and which also connect to some of the things that the other speakers have said. I think, Jacob, we cannot ignore the question of financial resources and resources as political, and money as political in the kind of world that we live in, where you need to have money in order to do anything. We cannot then run away from the politics of money and how money circulates or does not circulate, and the power that shapes the circulation of money as a critical part of thinking about philanthropy. So I don't think that is something that we can run away from. The second thing that's linked to that, which brings back the question of power and structural inequalities, is the risks that we face sometimes in trying to conceptualize philanthropy in the broadest sense, particularly in thinking through African philanthropy, and collapsing a whole range of things as evidence of philanthropy where they actually illustrate the failures of the state, the failure of the socio-economic political project. And here, for instance, I'm thinking about mutual aid, and mutual aid includes all of the chamas, the susus, the Stockwells, as mechanisms that communities have historically developed to mitigate the gaps that actually in a well-functioning society, the resources that are being redistributed and reorganized among small groups of people should actually be catered for in different ways, whether through a health system that is functioning, an education system that is functioning, or a sort of welfare system that caters for those who are less disadvantaged in our society. So while I recognize the thing about black tax, I think a critical view of what black tax actually is telling us would be a much more helpful way of allowing us to distinguish between forms of philanthropy that are really about broad-based structural change work vis-a-vis the kinds of things that we have to do, because if we do not do them, our relatives are going to be in positions that we will not necessarily be able to publicly defend, especially if we are more economically mobile. The third point that I wanted to speak to is the question of technology as an enabler, but also the ways in which through capital, as well as the intersection with state and non-state actors, the realm of technology becomes a disenabler. So whether we are talking about the raft of laws that have contributed to tapping of cell phones, the way those laws have been used around anti-terrorism mechanisms across a range of our countries, the taxes that are currently being developed by folks, younger people who are now using technology, YouTube, and other forms of social media as income-generating mechanisms. So if technology is an enabler for connection, we must also pay attention to the way in which technology has been used by nefarious actors for actions that are not necessarily enabling democratization or the broadening of collaboration and communication, but actually seek to actively thwart those mechanisms of broad engagement. The final and fourth point, which is really underpinned by this notion of power and change, and I say this in a tongue-in-cheek way, but perhaps not as well. I think that whenever we also consume this language of our governments of foreign agenda, particularly in relation to questions such as gender equality, it's worth bearing in mind that some of us would not be seated in this room speaking if the questions of gender equality were foreign agendas. We would not be here, right? We would be barefoot, pregnant, and serving tea, as people who are sort of doing the kind of hidden and paid work that still exists in a lot of our society. So it's quite important for us to also adopt a very critical view of the essentialist ways and instrumentalist ways that governments deploy the language of foreign agenda when it suits them, and then lean into these ideas that they consider Western as useful to them when it actually helps them reaffirm, reassert, and circulate power in ways that matter to the political elite and those who are powerful in societies. Thank you, Chair.
I think we're having some challenges with technology. We'll come back to you once.
Okay.
Are you there now?
Hello?
I can hear you also.
Okay, cool. There's a couple of questions that have been fielded on my side. I'll try to go through all of them because I was just documenting them here. The first one was looking at, I think, was it gender or the girl child and access to technology and how probably it can help, if I'm correct, if I took the question correct. The way I understood the question is obviously how would maybe technology enable such projects like that to either thrive or to reach those who we cannot reach today. One of the things I keep saying to people is it's very easy to forget where we came from when you look at technology. In 1990, probably 90% of Africa had never had a phone ringing, let alone having a phone. Today, over 60-70% of Africa have a cell phone in their hand. That journey has taken 30 years. That journey has been achieved. Remember, initially governments were against telecommunications companies, the mobile companies. But over the years, they've embraced it. They started taxing it. But most of the development we have seen that has been ushered in this industry has been ushered by private sector money and individuals who are pioneers in this industry. So to look at it today, most of the youth, most of the people we work with, it's very easy sometimes to conclude that they don't have access to these technologies. A cell phone is not an individual one-to-one thing in certain communities. One cell phone can save 5 people, can save 10 people, depending on the content that is being delivered. So one of the things that I would say on that question around the female individuals having access to technology or enabling their projects, I do believe there's a lot of ways to achieve that today, and there's still a gap that needs to be filled. The question is it a government responsibility, private sector, CSO, NGO responsibility? I do believe everyone has to play a part until we get to a point where people have access to this technology. There was a brother who was talking about the old people and the young people. There's so many programs today that are available through many CSOs, many NGOs, and many initiatives around reskilling. All of us in this room, in 5 to 10 years' time, we're going to go back to school to learn something new. Unless if we want to die without enough knowledge, right? So the idea of reskilling is a must for everyone. And there could be programs designed for that. There could be initiatives designed for that. We now live in this AI world where there's ChatGPT. There's a lot of things going on. My grandmother does not even understand the cell phone, let alone will she understand ChatGPT. So for me, I do believe that there is going to be those, unfortunately, who will be left behind. We need to find solutions for those guys. Researchers, entrepreneurs need to come up with solutions for that. But the overarching statement I always say is we have come from afar, guys. Let's not underestimate the transition we've gone through to be where we are today, the barriers we have overcome. I know there's still a lot to be done, but I think there's a lot that is going on. But the concept of reskilling ourselves is going to be a must, especially on technology. Otherwise, we're going to be left behind. The other thing is there is a lot of content already available for free on the internet. But the thing about people sometimes is we maybe are transfixed in a classroom setup, in a training setup, in a program setup, but content is available. It's also about how do we get to access that content. The other question was talking about how the big technology companies can come and help us. I think we are already at a point where we are developing a lot of solutions by ourselves. And let's first of all nurture what our own people are doing, then we can call upon those guys to capacitate and scale us. Because gone are the days where we need to consistently rely on people from abroad. We've all learned abroad before we came back to Africa. Can we not develop some of these things for our own and then build on what's existing? Microsoft, all these big companies, they're doing a lot of work in Africa today through multiple foundations, programs to help us. But we need to help ourselves also and come up with solutions to address these problems. If you are going to design programs, let's design programs that take the youth from a perspective of understanding technology to developing technology. We understand our continent more than anyone else. We cannot wait for these guys to come tell us how we can launch a program here or do stuff down here. So for me, I'm more about us taking the initiative ourselves, going to reskill and empowering ourselves. The question of the 4th industrial revolution, what I can tell you about engineers, scientists, and technology people, they love technologies. 4th industrial, 5th, 3rd, whatever it is. At the end of the day, does it change our lives? We just need to go back to the basics and understand that what is this 4th industrial revolution? Can I tell my grandmother about it? Does it change my grandmother's life or not? So there is an understanding and appreciation we need to have around these revolutions people talk about, and see how basically do they address the problem we have of water that is not of good quality? Do they address the problems in healthcare of people still dying out of malaria in this generation, cholera and all these diseases? So for me, I rather look at all of these terminologies, initiatives people talk about from a perspective, are they impacting people and are they changing our lives? The other question that was spoken about was the trade one, Africa Free Continental Trade Agreement. I know the African Union has a lot of initiatives. This one is one great one, but the adoption of it is not easy because you're trying to amalgamate 54 countries to start trading together in their own currency, moving products across borders. There is a lot of work that is going on again. And we might not let's not forget where we are coming from. All of these things, it was difficult to move a product from South Africa to Zimbabwe than maybe moving a product from London into South Africa. But today, there's so many innovations that are coming up to address that. So my conclusion around this is it's about us more than the outside people. It's about what programs we're designing. We know AI is coming. We know technology is taking over our lives. How are we redesigning even our programs? They are thinking on policy, frameworks, safety of data, privacy to address that. Because if we don't do anything, certain people from outside will come and influence that for us. And we're sitting here with all the capacity we have and we're doing nothing about it. So for me, like I said initially, I'm one of those guys who's a proponent that Africa can do it. We need to come together, design programs, initiatives, so that we can be the ones to champion. M-Pesa was born out of Kenya, not in London. Many things are born out of Africa, not in any other part of the world. So we can do this. But the question is, are we diverting our attention to the right things and developing our people and running programs that address that? I might have forgotten some other questions, but thank you very much for that.
Answered everything and even added a lot more. Thank you. Rosalind?
Structures are not working, then why don't we use the informal structures? So if I want to talk about the informality, if you talk about the informality, it's all another concept in itself. So when you look at the local communities, and I'll fall back to what Jacob was asking, whether you've seen communities maybe demonstrating against the NGOs, the answer, of course, is no. Maybe there are some few. And the reason why is because you need the formal structures to be able to be heard. For example, if I go back to the Tanzanian context, if you look at the issues they have, first of all, they are minority issues. So in that case, will the community support you? For example, the gender issues. For example, the human rights like the LGBTQ and all that. So it all falls back to who has the upper hand when it comes to power. We still have patriarchal systems, which is very prevalent globally, even and mostly in the African context. Another thing is the culture, which is driving most of these issues. So in that case, if you want to mobilize the community to just fight for those issues, they need formal structures to do that. And some of the reasons why these local CSOs are deregistered is because they don't meet some of the requirements. They don't register. So if you don't register and you're not in the system, how are you going to fight for this system? So in a way, as much as there are so many informal ways of doing things, but I think if you really want to be heard, if you really want your issues to be addressed, then maybe the formal structures is maybe a preference in that case. Another issue is that let's look at the government policies. Of course, the government will always have power. Even, for example, what's going on in Tanzania now, even the formal NGOs themselves, they have fear of maybe intimidating the government. So if you look at the local NGOs now, they do not have a voice. So in that case, some of these things, if you want to advocate for them, you might have to fall more into the formal structures. And I just want to go back to what Jacob was saying about the financial. Like, do we even need to talk about the funding? So I think from what I've learned is that I think we have monetized too much philanthropy in Africa. And maybe we need to fall back to the traditional ways of maybe how we were doing the giving, the philanthropic ways. For example, now if you want to dig a well, people will just think of where do we get the funding to be able to do it. But if you look at back in the days, people used to come together to fundraise themselves and do it doesn't have to involve money, maybe just labor and you do the work. So in that case, maybe it's a question of, is funding really shrinking the space, or it's ourselves who are making the funding to shrink our space? Thank you so much.
Yeah, thank you. So I think you probably have taken words out of my mouth to answer some of the questions that perhaps I wanted to tackle. So the good phrase that was said, BBT, born before technology, right? So I'll show you some statistics here, or I'll tell you some statistics here. There's been a growth in the smartphone use in South Africa. In 2014, which is not so long ago, there were only 9.7 million smartphones. In 2014, there were only 9. And I'm talking about this in the context of what we found in terms of mobile giving as a way. It's technology-linked type of giving. So it links to the smartphone. So until 2022, there was 25.5 million. So that's a tremendous growth in the smartphone users. So it came from 17% to 42% of the population having smartphones. And in terms of mobile giving, according to what our study found, is that it's through the mobile technology that a lot of money were raised, either through the internet directly. Even the crowdfunding, the current system of crowdfunding is mostly internet-based. And so that growth, or that trajectory in the smartphone translates into that. So definitely technology is enabling the space. Okay. Number 2, I think it's about money. So Prof. Jacob talks, I mean, you threw us, this is a very good question actually. Is it an enabler or a disenabling? So it's both, I would say so. It's both because, number one, the programs, the processes, everything that happens within the space definitely needs a financial resource. But it is disenabling, and this one I'm landing on what Tendai says well, it's punishment by capital. And this punishment by capital brings what we call distorted agenda. And that distorted agenda is as a result of the muscles that the owners of the resources, especially financial resources, have. And so whatever happens has to happen given, I mean, flowing from their agendas, from their what they want, from what they need to happen. And number 3, out of that, it now makes these organizations lack autonomy. There's no autonomy. You cannot decide on yourself what to do. And that without that, there's no agility. There is no growth, literally. And then that one lends itself to lack of sustainability. And there is no growth at the end of the day. So I'll stop there. Thank you.
Cliff, Jacob gave me graciously 15 minutes before the start of the session. I'm happy to say I'm handing over 10 minutes back to you. Thank you, Awino, Oswald, Wycliffe, and Rosalind. Very, very important interventions. And thank you so much, colleagues, for your responses, your questions, and your participation. Thank you so much. I think you deserve a round of applause. And back to you, Jacob.